Welcome to the Echoes of Ihsan podcast. Today, we're going to be diving into a topic that's really fascinating. And honestly, when I first started reading this, it kind of blew my mind. We're going to be looking at Islamic guidelines for slaughtering animals. And we're going to be doing this deep dive through the lens of a foundational text in Islamic jurisprudence, the Muwatta Imam Malik, specifically Book 24, Slaughtering Animals. This book, it gives us this really interesting look into how early Muslims, how they understood and practiced their faith. I mean, some of these rulings, I have to admit, they really surprised me.
Yeah, it's a fascinating area of Islamic law, just full of rich details and
Really?
insights into the values that underpin these practices. It's not just about the physical act of slaughter, but it's about the intention, the respect for life, acknowledging God's blessing.
Exactly. So for our listeners, imagine you're getting ready to make a meal that has meat in it. Have you ever thought about the journey that meat took to get to your plate? Well, in Islam, that journey, it's guided by a very specific set of rules and principles. One of the things that really stood out to me when I was reading this was the importance of saying God's name before slaughter. Now, it might seem like a small detail, but it actually has really profound implications. In Book 24, there's this hadith where the Prophet Muhammad, he's asked about eating meat when you're unsure if God's name was even mentioned.
Yeah, the hadith narrated by Hisham ibn Urwa. I mean, it's a common scenario, even today. Someone might be invited to a meal, or they might be buying meat from the market, and they don't know the exact details of the slaughter. And the Prophet, in his wisdom, he advised to just say God's name yourself and eat the meat. And this highlights the central importance of tasmiyah, which is the act of invoking God's name. It's a way of acknowledging that all sustenance comes from God and expressing gratitude for his blessings.
It's like
Everything
I've
else-
learned, it's like a recognition that
Well,
even in
yeah.
that act of taking a life for food, we're ultimately dependent on God's provision.
Exactly. And this act of remembrance, bringing God into that moment, it transforms this seemingly mundane act into something that's imbued with spiritual significance.
Now, this is where it gets even more interesting. There's another story in the Muwatta that really shows the importance of not just the words, but the intention behind them. It's the story of Abdullah ibn Ayyash, who refused to eat meat because his slave
Mm,
wasn't sincere
yeah,
when saying God's name.
yeah. It's a powerful reminder of the concept of niyyah, or intention, which is really a cornerstone of Islamic practice. Abdullah ibn Ayyash, he was known for his piety
Yeah.
and his, meticulous adherence to religious guidelines. And he noticed that his slave, while going through the motions of saying God's name, he wasn't doing it with sincerity. And this really troubled him to the point that he swore he wouldn't eat the meat.
I can almost picture the scene. Abdullah ibn Ayyash, he's watching his slave. He senses this disconnect between the words and the heart. And then this righteous anger rising within him. It really highlights that. For an act to be truly Islamically sound, it's not enough to just go through the motions. It's about aligning your heart with your actions, being present, aware of the spiritual weight of what you're doing.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that our actions are a reflection of our inner state. And that sincerity, that deep alignment between our inner and outer worlds, it's really key in every aspect of our lives. It's something to reflect on, even beyond the realm of ritual slaughter.
Okay, so we've established saying God's name and having the right intention are crucial. But what happens when you're in a situation where the ideal method of slaughter is impossible? Like, say, you're lost in the wilderness, facing starvation. The only tool you have is a sharp rock.
That's where the concept of necessity or darura comes into play. Islamic law is remarkably adaptable, and it recognizes that there are times when strict adherence to the rules might be impossible or even harmful.
So there are exceptions built in. That's fascinating. What does the Muwatta have to say about that?
Well, the Muwatta Imam Malik, it provides some compelling examples. There's a hadith about a man at Uhud. Now, Uhud, this was the site of a famous battle in early Islamic history, and this man's pregnant she-camel was dying. The man, he was in dire straits, he needed sustenance, his camel was nearing its end. Out of necessity, he slaughtered it. But he did it with a sharp stake, not the traditional knife. And when the Prophet Muhammad was asked about it, he ruled that there was no harm in eating the meat.
Wow. So even though using a stake isn't the usual method, it was allowed because of the dire circumstance.
Exactly. It shows how flexible Islamic law is. It recognizes the human condition. The principle of necessity overrides the typical requirements.
Oh, I see a similar example, right? The story of the slave girl who slaughtered a sheep with a stone because it was about to die.
Yes, that's in the Muwatta as well. Imagine this young woman, perhaps she was tasked with tending the flock, and she finds a sheep in distress. It's close to death. She doesn't have the usual tools for slaughter, but she knows that the animal's suffering, and the meat will go to waste if she doesn't act. So she uses what's available to her, a stone, to end the animal's suffering and preserve the meat. And the prophet, upon hearing about this, ruled that the meat was permissible to eat.
It seems like the focus in these rulings is on two things: alleviating the animal's suffering
Yeah.
and making use of the meat in a difficult situation.
Absolutely. And this ties into the broader principle of mercy, or Rahma, which is deeply embedded in Islamic teachings. Islam teaches compassion and kindness, not just for fellow humans, but for all living creatures. These rulings reflect that. They show that Islamic law, while having clear guidelines, is not rigid or heartless. It takes into account the complexities of life and allows for flexibility.
Okay, so we've talked about the importance of intention, the flexibility in cases of necessity. But what about meat slaughtered by non-Muslims? Is that permissible to eat?
That's a question that comes up often. And the Muwatta Imam Malik addresses it directly. There is an account of Abdullah ibn Abbas. He was a cousin of the Prophet and a renowned scholar. And he was asked about animals slaughtered by Christian Arabs. His response was that there was no harm in eating them.
So Muslims can eat meat slaughtered by Christians, no restrictions.
Well, it's not quite that simple. While Ibn Abbas said there was no harm in consuming the meat, he also recited a verse from the Quran that advises against taking them as allies. It's from Surah 5, verse 54, and it speaks to the complex relationship between the early Muslim community and other groups in the Arabian Peninsula at the time.
So there's a political dimension to consider as well.
Exactly. It's important to understand the historical context. This ruling was given during a time when Muslims and people of other Abrahamic faiths, particularly Christians and Jews, were interacting really closely. They were known as al-Kitab, meaning people of the book.
And what about today? Do these rulings still apply?
That's where things get a little bit more complicated. Different schools of Islamic thought have varying interpretations of these rulings. Some scholars argue that the permissibility of consuming meat slaughtered by non-Muslims depends on factors like whether the slaughterer believes in one God and whether the method of slaughter aligns with Islamic guidelines. For instance, some scholars might argue that meat from a factory farm, where animals are often treated inhumanely, regardless of who performs the slaughter, would not be permissible because of ethical concerns.
So it sounds like that's not a simple yes or no answer. It's a topic that requires careful consideration and perhaps even consultation with knowledgeable scholars.
You're absolutely right. It's a topic that invites deeper reflection on the principles of Islamic law and how they're applied in a diverse world.
This deep dive, it's already proving to be quite enlightening.
We've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to explore in the Muwatta Imam Malik on this topic.
Well, before we move on, I want to touch on another fascinating section. It's the discussion on what's disliked in slaughtering. It's a bit more technical, but it really gets into the details of these guidelines. Shows just how detailed they are.
I agree. And the example of the sheep that moved after being slaughtered, it's a great illustration of how meticulous these guidelines are.
Right. The story goes that Abu Huraira, a companion of the Prophet, was asked about a sheep that moved after being slaughtered. Imagine the scene. People gathered, maybe during a communal meal or a sacrifice, and then this unexpected thing happens. The sheep twitches or moves after his throat has been cut. Abu Huraira, based on his understanding, said it was fine to eat. But then Zayd ibn Thabit, another companion of the Prophet, disagreed. He said it shouldn't be eaten because it was like a corpse moving.
And what's fascinating here is that this difference of opinion, even among the companions of the Prophet, it highlights a really important aspect of Islamic jurisprudence, the role of scholarly debate and differing interpretations.
So even among those closest to the Prophet, there were disagreements. That's surprising to me.
Yes. It shows that Islamic legal thought isn't monolithic. There's room for different perspectives, different understandings, and this ongoing process of interpretation and debate. It keeps the tradition alive and relevant. The Muwatta Imam Malik itself represents the legal school of Imam Malik, who considered things like blood flow and blinking eyes as signs of life, which were crucial in determining the validity of the slaughter.
And if those signs weren't there, it meant the animal wasn't properly slaughtered, and therefore the meat wouldn't be halal.
Exactly. There are specific guidelines to ensure the animal's properly and humanely slaughtered and wasn't already dead before the act.
It's all about minimizing the animal's suffering and ensuring the meat is halal. These details, while they might seem minor, they really show the level of care and consideration that goes into these practices.
Precisely. These seemingly small details, they reflect a deep concern for ethical treatment and aligning with God's will. even in the most everyday actions. It's a reminder that in Islam, spirituality isn't confined to the mosque or the prayer rug. It permeates every aspect of life, even the food we consume.
So, we've covered the importance of invoking God's name, the flexibility in cases of necessity, the nuances of consuming meat slaughtered by non-Muslims, and the guidelines for proper slaughter. But there's one more topic I'm really curious about, and it's probably the most complex one we've encountered so far. What happens to a fetus in the womb of a slaughtered animal?
Ah, yes. That's a fascinating question. That delves into the very nature of life, ensoulment, and the delicate balance between practicality and adhering to religious guidelines. It's a topic that requires a deep dive all on its own.
It does. All right, so we're back and we're ready to tackle what might be the most.
Mind-boggling question in this whole deep dive into Islamic slaughter guidelines. What happens to a fetus when a pregnant animal is slaughtered?
It definitely gets us thinking about the beginnings of life and where Islamic law draws those lines, doesn't it? It's not just a practical matter. It touches on some really deep philosophical and theological concepts. It does. I mean, on the surface, you might think, well, the fetus is inside the mother, so it's automatically included in the slaughter, right? But Islamic law, it's rarely that straightforward.
You're absolutely right. It's far more nuanced than that. The Muwatta Imam Malik. It gives us some guidance on this. It all boils down to the stage of development the fetus has reached.
So how does that work? What are the criteria?
Well, there's a narration from Abdullah ibn Umar, a companion of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that sheds some light on this. He states that if the fetus is perfectly formed, meaning its organs and limbs have developed, and its hair has already begun to grow, then its slaughter is considered to be included in the mother's slaughter.
Okay, so there's a visual marker there, the hair growth. That signals a certain level of development. But what if the fetus hasn't reached that stage yet?
In that case, Ibn Umar says, if the fetus comes out of the womb alive after the mother is slaughtered, then it needs to be slaughtered separately. And there's a specific reason for that. To ensure that blood flows from its heart.
Now that's a detail that I found really intriguing. Why is the blood flow so important?
It's a fundamental concept in Islamic slaughter guidelines. Remember, the goal is to minimize the animal's suffering and to ensure a swift and humane death. The flow of blood, it signifies that the heart has stopped beating, that life has ended. And by extension, it also plays a role in the concept of halal, of making the meat permissible for consumption.
Ah, so there's a connection there
Yeah.
between the physical act, the biological reality of death,
Yeah.
and the spiritual concept of halal.
Precisely. It's not just about following a set of rules blindly. It's about understanding the reasoning behind them, the interconnectedness of the physical and the spiritual.
Okay, so back to the fetus. You mentioned that a perfectly formed fetus with hair growth is considered part of the mother's slaughter. Does this tie into the concept of ensoulment at all?
That's a brilliant observation. You've touched upon one of the most profound aspects of this discussion, the timing of ensoulment, the moment when a soul is believed to enter the body. It's a matter of ongoing theological debate within Islam. But this ruling, the emphasis on a certain level of physical development, seems to suggest that a fetus reaching that stage might be a factor in determining its status, its individual life, and the need for separate slaughter.
So it's almost like Islamic law is acknowledging the potential for independent life in that fetus, even though it's still within the mother's womb.
Exactly. It reflects a profound respect for life, even in its nascent stages, a recognition that there's a sanctity to life that must be honored. And it's not just about the biological facts, it's about the moral and spiritual implications as well.
This is why I find this whole topic so fascinating. It's not just about dry rules. It's about grappling with these big existential questions. It's about understanding how faith intersects with the realities of life and death, of biology and ethics.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's about applying eternal principles to real-world situations and navigating those complexities with wisdom and compassion.
No. The Muwatta Imam Malik. It actually reinforces this understanding of fetal slaughter with another narration, this time from Sa'id ibn al-Musayyab, a prominent jurist from the early Islamic period.
Ah, yes, said Ibn al-Musayyab. He was known for his deep knowledge of Islamic law and his piety. His opinions were highly respected among the scholars of his time.
And what does he have to say about the slaughter of a fetus?
His ruling echoes that of Ibn Umar, emphasizing consistency and understanding. Across different scholars and companions of the Prophet, he states that if the fetus is fully formed and has hair, then slaughtering the mother suffices for the fetus as well. But if it comes out alive and moving, then separate slaughter is required.
So we see a clear continuity there. It's not just one isolated opinion,
Right.
but a well-established principle within Islamic jurisprudence.
Absolutely. And this consistency is important because it shows that these rulings aren't arbitrary or based on individual whims. They're grounded in a deep understanding of Islamic teachings and a careful consideration of the ethical and practical implications.
I have to say, this whole deep dive into the Islamic guidelines for slaughtering animals has really made me appreciate the depth and nuance of Islamic law. It's not just a set of rigid rules, but a framework that tries to address even the most intricate questions of life and death, of how we interact with the world around us, and how we honor the sanctity of life in all its forms.
That's a beautiful way to put it. It's about seeking balance, about recognizing the complexities of life, while staying true to the core values of compassion, respect, and God consciousness.
Yeah, we've spent quite a bit of time unpacking these guidelines, but I want to shift gears for a moment and talk about how these practices actually play out in the lives of Muslims today. Do these rulings have a tangible impact on their relationship with food and the animals they consume?
That's a great question, and one that gets to the heart of how faith translates into lived experience. It's important to remember that these rulings are more than just abstract legal concepts. They shape the way many Muslims approach something as basic as eating. For many, these guidelines are a way to connect with their faith on a daily basis, to be mindful of God's blessings, and to show gratitude for the sustenance they receive.
So it becomes more than just a physical act of eating, right?
Huh.
It's imbued with spiritual significance.
Exactly. And the act of slaughtering, when done according to these guidelines, becomes an act of worship in itself by invoking God's name, acknowledging his blessings, and ensuring the animal is treated with respect. Muslims are reminded of their place in the world and their responsibility towards God's
It's
creation.
like they're bringing a sense of sacredness
Okay.
into the entire process.
Exactly. And this awareness also influences the way many Muslims view their relationship with animals, knowing that the animal they're consuming has been treated with respect, that its life was taken in a way that minimized suffering, and that the act itself was done with the remembrance of God. It can bring a sense of peace and gratitude.
It's about recognizing the interconnectedness of all life, the delicate balance between taking a life for sustenance and honoring the sanctity of that life.
Precisely. It's a reminder that we share this world with other living beings, and that we have a responsibility to treat them with kindness and compassion.
So in a way, these guidelines are about much more than just meat consumption. They're about cultivating a deeper consciousness of God's presence, showing respect for life, and acknowledging our place in the grand scheme of creation.
Absolutely, and that's what makes these teachings so relevant and powerful. Even today, they provide a framework for living a life that is aligned with our values and our faith in every aspect, from the food we eat to the way we interact with the world around us.
This deep dive has been incredibly eye-opening. I'm already looking at the food on my plate in a whole new light.
It's amazing how exploring these ancient texts can give us a fresh perspective on even the most familiar aspects of our lives.
And it's a testament to the enduring wisdom of Islamic teachings, their ability to speak to the human condition across time and cultures.
Indeed. These guidelines offer a timeless framework for navigating the complexities of life with grace, compassion, and a deep connection to the divine.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, from the importance of invoking God's name to the nuanced rulings on fetuses and meat slaughtered by non-Muslims. We've explored the historical context, the theological debates, and the ethical considerations that underpin these practices. But I feel like we've only just scratched the surface of this fascinating topic.
You're absolutely right. The Muwatta Imam Malik, it's just one of many rich sources of Islamic knowledge that can guide us in our understanding of these practices.
Welcome back to the Echoes of Ihsan podcast. We've been on quite a journey, exploring these guidelines for slaughtering animals in Islam, as laid out in the Muwatta Imam Malik.
It has been fascinating, hasn't it? Delving into all these intricate details of Islamic law and the really profound values that underpin these practices.
It really has. As we've been discussing these rulings, I keep thinking back to something you mentioned earlier, this idea that these guidelines, they reflect these broader Islamic values, like respect for life, God consciousness, and mercy toward animals. I mean, it's one thing to understand the rules themselves, but it's another to grasp the deeper significance behind them.
You've hit the nail on the head. These guidelines, they aren't just about the mechanics of slaughter. They're about cultivating this deeper awareness of our relationship with God, with the creatures we share this planet with, and with the act of sustenance itself.
So how do these centuries-old rulings, these specific guidelines about how to slaughter an animal, How do they speak to those broader values? It's such a fascinating connection.
Well, let's start with respect for life. The emphasis on saying God's name before slaughter. The tasmiyah. It's a powerful reminder that life is sacred, and that taking a life, even for sustenance, is not something to be taken lightly. It's an act that should be approached with humility and a deep sense of responsibility.
It's acknowledging that this animal,
Yeah.
this life, it's a gift from God.
Exactly. And that recognition, it extends beyond the moment of slaughter. The guidelines around proper slaughter, ensuring the animal is treated humanely, minimizing its suffering. They further underscore this respect for life. It's not about dominion or exploitation, but about recognizing the inherent value of all living beings.
It's a reminder that, even in the act of taking a life for food, we are called to act with compassion and care.
Absolutely. And this respect for life, it's a value that transcends the realm of food consumption. It informs the way Muslims approach their interactions with all living creatures, from the smallest insects to the largest animals.
So it's about cultivating a sense of reverence for the interconnectedness of all life, recognizing that we are part of a delicate web of existence.
Exactly. Now, alongside respect for life, we also see the principle of God consciousness woven throughout these guidelines, invoking God's name. It's not just a formality, it's this deliberate act that brings the entire process into a spiritual context.
It's like we're inviting God's presence into this seemingly mundane act, elevating it to something more meaningful.
You got it. And that awareness, it permeates the entire process, the intention behind the slaughter, adhering to these specific guidelines, focusing on minimizing the animal suffering. It all stems from this desire to align our actions with God's will. It's a recognition that we're not acting on our own, but we're ultimately answerable to a higher power.
It's fascinating how these practical physical guidelines, they serve as this constant reminder of our relationship with the divine, a way to bring spirituality into our daily lives.
Yes, and that connection to the divine, it's essential in understanding the Islamic perspective on the treatment of animals. It's not just about following rules out of fear of punishment, but it's about striving to live a life that is pleasing to God, a life that embodies compassion, justice, and mercy.
And speaking of mercy, that's another value that shines through in these rulings. The allowance for alternative methods of slaughter in cases of necessity. The flexibility we discussed earlier, it highlights the importance of alleviating suffering, even for animals.
Exactly. It's recognizing that. Sometimes strict adherence to the letter of the law, it has to give way to the spirit of compassion, especially when it comes to preventing unnecessary pain and hardship.
And even the rulings around the slaughter of a fetus, with all its complexities, they demonstrate a sensitivity to the potential for life, even in its earliest stages.
You're right. It's about recognizing the sanctity of life and treating it with the utmost respect, even in situations that might seem ambiguous or challenging.
This deep dive, it has truly shifted my perspective. It's made me realize that the way we treat animals, the way we approach food, it's all connected to our values and our understanding of our place in the world. It's about so much more than just the physical act of eating.
You've captured the essence of it. It's about aligning our actions with our beliefs, about bringing our spiritual values into our daily lives, and recognizing that even seemingly mundane acts can be infused with meaning and purpose.
So as we wrap up this exploration of the Muwatta Imam Malik, what's one final thought you would like to leave our listeners with?
I would encourage everyone to reflect on how these principles might manifest in their own lives, even if you don't adhere to the specific practices of Islamic slaughter. The underlying values, respect for life, God consciousness, mercy, they're universal. How can we bring these values into our own interactions with the natural world, with the food we consume, and with all living beings? It's a question worth pondering.
That's a powerful invitation for all of us to consider. Regardless of our backgrounds or beliefs, it's a reminder that we all have a role to play in creating a more just, compassionate, and harmonious world. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Echoes of Ihsan.